this brutally chilly and winter South African afternoon, I welcome you to yet another installment of the Innovation in Action lecture series, proudly brought to you by the Directorate of Innovation, Technology Transfer and Commercialization at the University of South Africa. This is a first of its kind of series for UNISA, where we invite African innovators, entrepreneurs, investors who have built solutions in their communities and taken it to the world and across the continent. And today is no different. I am Violeta Dubese, an innovation consultant by trade, and today I have the great pleasure of being your host as we receive a lecture from Melvin Lubega, an entrepreneur and the co-founder of GoOne, which up until a few weeks ago has become the very first South African tech scale-up to be valued at more than $1 billion US, and what is called a unicorn. He's also an investor as well as a digital evangelist, and you'll hear more from him in just a few moments. A reminder, I know I say this all the time, but this is your lecture to own. So we do encourage you to engage with us in the chat function by networking with your fellow innovators. I've already seen a couple of comments and introductions that are being made. We do encourage you to do so. And also influencing this next point to please switch off your mics if you are not speaking or asking a question to our guest lecturer, as well as to save some bandwidth on your end to switch off your video. Now, to ensure that we do get this best audio and visual quality, that is what we encourage you to do. There will be a Q&A segment after the lecture, an opportunity for you to engage with our guest lecturer. And if you do want to ask a question, then please click on the raise your hand function or write it simply in the chat zone. And now to officially welcome us into today's proceedings, he is joining us today and taking a break from the past few weeks. We do welcome Ayanda Noma, the Director of Innovation, Technology Transfer and Commercialization. Ayanda, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Will. Good afternoon, everyone. You know, today I'm really quite excited. I'm not sure if if I should be though, because I just got a message just literally a few minutes before that says that I must report somewhere for vaccination. So I'm excited, but a bit apprehensive about it. You know, I say the joys of being over 50. But good afternoon, everyone, and really welcome. You know, to this session, which is organized by the Directorate of Innovation, Technology Transfer and Commercialization at UNISA. You know, just to say a bit about our mandate, we are what is normally referred to as a technology transfer office, you know, but we do much more than that. There are quite a number of activities that we're involved in, but we're primarily responsible for the protection of intellectual property that comes out of UNISA's R&D activities. But we do provide advice, you know, to innovators, entrepreneurs, in IP matters. But we run quite a number of programs targeted at, you know, sort of harnessing, you know, the innovative potential of both staff and students within the university. We also responsible for creating this, you know, what we call an entrepreneurial culture within the university, and that involves, you know, innovation in action lecture series, which was part of, you know, our bigger advocacy program. We run quite a number of awareness sessions, you know, training interventions, you know, really focusing on how to harness those innovative ideas and convert them into sort of viable businesses that actually begin to impact, or rather, you know, into solutions, you know, to some of the challenges that society faces. And of course, you know, establishing businesses as part of that is actually one of the, you know, the key components, you know, of those programs. We also run what is called a UNISA pre-incubation program, where we support innovators and help them through the process of developing their solutions, you know, so that they you know, so that they can deploy those solutions in the marketplace. You know, it's a very big program. We also run I never miss the opportunity, of talking about the DITTC, the work that we've been doing. So you'll indulge me a little bit. We're also responsible for the UNISA International Student Exchange Program, very much focused, this one on innovation, where, innovators that are making progress, that are really developing their innovative solutions, they really get an opportunity of spending time, in other incubators, abroad, where they get to sort of develop further their innovative ideas. So we're really quite excited to be driving this innovation agenda within the entrepreneurship agenda within the university. And of course, the fact that you're here and you always show up, for this event is something that, gives us a sense of encouragement to say that, we are on the right path. So we truly appreciate that we've made the time, right, to be part of the session. And of course, a special welcome, to our speaker, this afternoon, Melvin. I've been looking forward to your presentation, ever since we touched base, and I'm happy that your mama is here, right, which is my colleague that is responsible for the pre-incubation program, because I see all the people that we sort of that spoke this year as part of the Innovation Action Lecture Series, people that I think we should keep the connection with you guys. We should keep the connection with you, Melvin, and of course, I mean, with the people that we have, that we interact with, and we're sure that you're definitely going to definitely add value, to the work that we do. We truly appreciate the fact that you've made the time, to share your experience and with us, and I'm sure that we all gonna benefit. We're all gonna be richer, at the end of the day. And of course, Vuyo, today I'm just coming from a session, right, where it's really about getting 3 universities from different universities, sort of different continents, to come together and work on a proposal around innovation and entrepreneurship. And one of the words that kept coming up was a system player, right? And for me, there's a book that I sort of read that I actually like a lot, that I think people should actually read if we have a chance. It's called, the Rainforest. It's really not about a forest, but it's really about the entrepreneur ecosystem, right? And the various things that that you'd find in a rainforest that actually signify the kind of species that you require in an entrepreneur ecosystem. And of course, you are that person that connects people, that brings people together in an ecosystem. And I'm sure we're really grateful that we've actually agreed as well to actually do this. Well, thank you very much for that. With those few words, colleagues, let me hand over to Vuyo so that you can get on. I'm sure you can't wait to hear from Melvin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed, for truly engaging us about the innovation and entrepreneurship agenda that the university is driving. I think it's always quite exciting to learn about the projects that are being undertaken, the programs that are being undertaken, and also UNISA's role in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. I think universities have quite a great role to play, and I'm sure Melvin will attest to the role of education and universities as he maps out his journey in innovation. And without wasting any further time, please welcome to our Innovation in Action lecture series our guest lecturer for today, Melvin Lubenga, who is an actuary by training, a builder of disruptive technologies that create impact by solving significant business and social challenges. And following his studies at Oxford, he co-founded Go1, which is now a world leader in online corporate training solutions and the world's largest marketplace of training, to have scaled to teams in 8 countries and over 1,000 clients across 25 countries, and also backed by the likes of Microsoft. Ever close to the latest disruptive technologies and global trends, he is an advisor to the Minister of of Communications and Digital Technologies on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, serving as a non-executive director of the entity. In the private sector, he also serves as an independent non-executive director of JSE-listed Adcorp Group, Africa's largest workplace solutions provider, as well as of Conduit Capital, a JSE-listed investment holdings company. Now, this is just one of the many hats that Melvin wears, and of course the list goes on, and we'll get to hear more about his journey in becoming a thought leader in innovation that he is today. Also, Ayanda, I just have to mention this as well. I saw this in one of his posts on social media that he is an aspirant professor. So there may be some way to wiggle in that role in there as we continue to have these conversations. But Melvin, I'll hand over the program to you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Vuyo, for that kind introduction. And thank you to Dr. Noma for, one, I think, convening and coordinating, I think, what is important conversations, particularly when it comes to innovation. It's always interesting, when one thinks through, past times when often it was felt as though, in the academic institutions, it was very difficult for there to be innovation because one almost felt they were stuck in a particular track based on the past. And I think definitely what we've seen in the advent of modern technologies is that being flipped on its head. And I think even from a perception perspective, outside in, just to thank everyone for joining this conversation. And we'll call it a conversation, not a lecture, until I receive that professorship. So thank you for planting that seed, Vuyo. I receive it. What I want to try and achieve from today's conversation at the outset is probably spend a few minutes giving the context a bit to what we do at Go1, just so you can get a sense of the lens through which I view innovation. And I think more importantly, also to say as a disclaimer that a lot of what I share is based on my experience and anecdotal, and I think by no means is it truth. And I think the purpose for today is the ability to just share exactly what it is that we've done and the lessons thereof. And then thereafter, what I want to do is then just draw on some I guess learnings per se. And ultimately, I want to conclude by sharing through my journey how anyone can develop, I think, one, market changing innovation, but also two, market creating innovation. And so do that by covering 3 points. I think one is, showing the importance of understanding the problem you're trying to solve. Two, by having a bias towards action. And I think three, most importantly, is having a singular focus. And if there's enough time, I want to try to loop that back to again, business context in terms of what does that mean for, I think, yourselves, anybody, if you're thinking about a business, starting a business, or even as a manager in a business, how you bring that to bear. And so I guess just to paint the picture again, and thank you for the humbling introduction there, Vuyo. So what we effectively do at Go1 is we exist to help people unlock a positive potential through a love for learning. And so human capital development is a big part of what we do and what keeps us excited in our day-to-day journey as we build the business. And how we do that is through our platform, which is effectively an online solution, which one could almost parallel to a Netflix for corporate training. So effectively, we aggregate over 100,000 learning items into one learning platform or ecosystem and offer that to organizations, governments, and individuals in over 28 countries. And so in doing so, it's almost from the, I guess, innovation, technology, software lens from which my experience has come. And by no means is the only means of innovation. Something I often reflect on is like the best innovations and technologies are the ones that are so permeate through society so deeply that one doesn't necessarily realize the technology. So no one ever switches on a light bulb and says, I wonder how a light bulb came to be or why there's light on light bulb, just because that innovation at its time, and now it being a technology, has just permeated so deeply in society that one never gives a second look. And so what one realizes is that innovation as a concept isn't necessarily something that is new. And I think, yes, there are buzzwords around innovation, technology, disruption, and all these important things. But when one thinks at its core, it's been around for a very long period of time. And so in the spirit of it being a lecture and putting out my CV for possibly becoming a professor one day, I thought it'd be remiss not to start, I guess, this particular conversation in its main with a reference to my time as a undergraduate student. And so undergrad first year, and I see that I may have been given the conch back. So what I'm going to do is actually share my screen ever so slightly, but as I do so, I will still paint the picture. And so undergrad, my undergrad was in actuarial science, and what was quite interesting then was, so no one necessarily does, I was on the commerce faculty, and no one does, let's just say, economics as a main subject. And I came across economics, and I was like, look, this is a great commerce-related subject, but it was something which I think many of us in our first year struggled to get along with, just because of the different nature of what it was to what you studied in high school, like maths and science and so forth. But I wanted to begin with the father of economics, and this is an epic mugshot, I believe, but this is Adam Smith, and believed to, or at least held as being the father of modern economics. And I think some of the core principles which, you know, he first brought to the fore in his early book and a seminal work in economics, The Wealth of Nations, are things like the invisible hand and specialization of division of labor, and some of which we'll unpack today. But there's a particular paragraph which reads in an early draft of his first document. I think it was from, must have been now the 1760s, and it speaks to division of labor. And so I'll read it just because for the benefit of the nuance, and then I want to unpack it a bit further. But it speaks to how the division of labor, which probably gave occasion to the invention of the greater part of those machines by which labor is such facilitated and abridged. When the whole force of the mind is directed to one particular project, as is the consequence of division of labor, it must be, the mind is more likely to discover the easiest methods of attaining that object than when the attention is dissipated among a great variety of things. And so there's a lot in there to unpack, but the principle of specialization, division of labor, just as a concept, and something which, and I may be exposing myself for being in a hard lockdown and missing having a braai with friends. But if you think of having a braai, what I've come to discover in my short life is that if you have a separate person cutting the rolls, buttering the bread, and also braaiing the boerewors, you'll probably be able to get the food faster than if the same person who was making the braai was cutting the buns and was actually preparing the boerewors. And I think this is something which, you know, is a well-studied concept, and I think it really came to the fore when in the Japanese system, when they were thinking about car manufacturing, and even thinking back to when Ford created, you know, the modern assembly line. Just the importance of, by breaking up a process into its constituent elements, one has the ability to really focus the mind. And so when you consider, I guess, specialization, division of labor, it's something which, again, is hundreds of years old, but I think for me really captures the essence of innovation. There's much to pick out here. And so when one thinks about specialization, and particularly when it comes down to focus, and so the principle here is that, you know, if one is focused on a particular set of tasks. So if you had to break down something very complex to very small elements and had to think, what is the problem that I'm actually solving, one has more capacity to actually get to the bottom of it and therefore apply themselves. And I think what, you know, further in Adam Smith's work, and actually I might just stop sharing my screen ever so slightly if I can pop out of here. Can I end the slideshow? Yes, I can. And I will come back. Awesome. And what I want to speak to there is, when he speaks to division of labor, he speaks to certain things around how, for example, as farmers, if you're the person who was actually milling the corn, you'd appreciate that having implements in your hand would make it easier. And I think when you think through innovation, people who are often best placed to innovate are those that are exposed to the problem. And, you know, this has been true on different levels. And so in the same way, if you experience a problem in your day-to-day life, and it's something that you feel as though you've taken a chance to try solve, but you're not getting right solutions, that's often where many will say innovation is best placed. And so if I think about our journey on Go One, for me, it was more so, I think, one, being an advisor and investor to small businesses, but more importantly, being a management consultant to big businesses, where what I realized in my journey was that many large businesses were having the problem of trying to solve business problems that were often a result of them not investing in their staff. And we as consultants need to come on board. So for example, if you are growing in a new sector, but your staff aren't keeping up a pace to actually unlock the opportunity that you believe is there as an organization, or you're forced to lay off people because your workforce hasn't been able to transition to the new working needs of your company, and all these sorts of things often came back to there being an issue with how they invested in their people. And in clicking deep into that particular problem, what I realized was that many large organizations at the time when we really began Go1 really didn't have the right tools to invest in their staff to make sure that they were learning and growing as their jobs went along. And so it's something which for us was really our guiding understanding of the problem. And I think what's fascinating here is Go1 is ultimately a learning and development, and ultimately our key stakeholder is an HR person and organization. Yet in our company, none of us as founders are HR professionals. And I mention this point not because it says that, look, all of a sudden we're deficient in our problem solving or understanding of the problem, but I think it just speaks to the point that anyone can understand a problem in order to innovate it, even if one isn't the direct person experiencing it. And so there are ones which, for example, something which I and many of them, I'm sure here in this call experience is, let's say, load shedding. And so I would argue that I have a mini PhD on the best load shedding applications that will tell you when Eskom is going to load shed, because that's a very real problem which I experienced, and I think many of us have at some point. And I took the time to actually understand the problem. And if you think about the context of even being in a university setting, just taking the time to understand the problem isn't, especially now with technology and there being so much information online, isn't necessarily limited by your academic background, what you're studying, or even how close you are to that problem. And often when, people often think that, no, look, you must be a professor to create IP, or you must be a PhD graduate. What you'll be surprised is that anyone has the ability to understand the problem. And by doing so and understanding the problem, one then has the ability to actually come up with a solution that is better than what is currently out there. And I think it's something which one often takes for granted. Whereas for a long time, if you weren't a specialist in a particular field, you would not have the ability to deeply understand that problem. And so for us in building our business, understanding our problem was a function of getting extremely close to our target customers. So with businesses, with HR managers, with L&D managers, and understanding the problems that they were solving, just so that we weren't necessarily building a platform that didn't necessarily meet their needs. And I think even in our journey, we've actually honed that particular skill. And so just for context, when we began the platform, what we created was a learning management system. So you can think of a learning management system as a bookshelf, essentially a platform where one is able to add their training content, their videos, and have it tracked. But in the same way that no one buys a bookshelf without wanting to buy books or having books, same way no one wants to buy an LMS without thinking about the content they want to have on the LMS. And so that's when we realized that, look, to ultimately solve the real problem of our HR managers, our target audience, we actually need to focus on having more than just the LMS, but go further along addressing their problem, which led us to then create what is our content library. And so again, the key takeaway there being just the importance of understanding the problem and letting one's understanding of the problem ultimately drive how one gets there. And so the other thing, which I guess is laid in what Adam Smith was sharing, is that the person who's actually working on that particular task has the greatest incentive to innovate. So for example, and it's a bit of a throwback to when I was young, and so I don't know in Joburg, if you're from Johannesburg, we have beautiful jacaranda trees. They have like the nice flowers and lights like pink, white flowers. And when I was growing up, we used to do the garden and do chores around the house. And so when it used to rain, somehow it's almost as if the water created adhesive between the leaves from the tree and the pavement outside our house. And so when it was my turn to sweep, especially after it rained, it was very difficult. And just because I knew that if I was able to find a better way of actually sweeping or find a better brush or better angle of doing this, I would get the most benefit, because I would spend hours trying to sweep this driveway and just like the leaves weren't moving. And so therefore, I had the strong incentive to actually find a better solution or find a more innovative one. I think what we see today, which is really fascinating, is the benefits of innovation aren't necessarily limited to those who deal with the actual problem itself. So these days, for example, if you're able to solve a problem for, let's say, for example, I don't know, pick an example around logistics, let's say Uber, the benefits aren't necessarily only accruing to the rider and let's say to the driver. But as the person actually creates that invention and innovation, so now I can think about the founders of Uber, just how well they've done, I guess, economically. Again, what you're seeing is that if you are able to solve innovation, the benefits can far outweigh the direct person who would otherwise benefit from it. And I think it speaks to the economies of scale that exist today. So if you're able to find, a gap in the market in terms of the innovation landscape, and I think most importantly, assuming that there's a market in that gap and the problem you're solving is a meaningful problem to many people, you can actually reach the scale, which therefore, again, creates the incentive, whether you're in South Africa, whether you're in America, within a rural or urban area. If you're able to innovate and solve a problem that actually is meaningful and scalable, you'll be able to reap those particular rewards. And something which was very true for us when we realized that, look, the challenge we're facing in learning and development professionally is one that we experienced, one for me as a consultant, my co-founders through some of the work they were doing, then in their consulting work. But we realized that it was a global problem. By solving a global problem, we're able to build a company which can have significant value because of the size of the problem we're solving. And so the insight for me there was the size of your, call it business or enterprise, is almost limited by the size of the problem you want to solve. And so something I always believe is that if you're going to solve a problem, you might as well solve the hard and the big problem, because it takes the same amount of effort to solve something big as does do something small. If you think about, for example, if you're running a Spaza store, let's say in a township versus running a JSE company, all of us have 24 hours in the day, and the stresses and pains, regardless of the size of the entity, will find you. And so I'm always a firm believer in doing things at scale. But I think in the same vein, whilst you can understand a problem and have an idea on how to solve it, I think what is more important is execution. And I don't think this is true in all spheres of innovation and IP creation, but I think of our own journey where when I remember, so we did this program in the US called Y Combinator, which is essentially an incubator, which I guess incubated Airbnb, Dropbox, Stripe, some very large companies within the ecosystem. And what was really true there was that many of the ideas for their businesses had been done before, but it came down to how well the founders and those teams executed. And, I think of early in our journey where me being a mini perfectionist, you almost want to release your product when it's perfect, or you want to send your marketing collateral to your clients once it's almost there. You don't want to burn clients and so forth. But the key insight, and something which Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, says very well, is that if you aren't embarrassed by the first release of your actual product or offering, you've released too late. And I think for me, it comes back to that feedback cycle around being close to your customer, understanding your problems, because you want to release something to the market and better understand, the needs of the customer. I remember when we first launched our product, we won the award for one of the best new learning platforms in the world because of the ease of use of our platform. And because at the time there were many learning platforms out there, but the key premise there was many of them were very unintuitive. And it's almost as if you had to learn how to learn in order so you could learn. And so it was a weird one where the tools themselves for learning were just very complex. And so when we then started to unpack, actually, look, how can we get this in front of our customers sooner rather than later? I remember when that announcement went out and we were, getting inquiries on our platform and literally manually spinning up portals for our customers and trying to customize things on the back end and literally doing things that didn't scale in the business. But the key goal was we wanted to execute and not necessarily get hung up on the idea, and rather let our customers give us that feedback. And so ultimately, when we think through innovation is an iterative cycle. And so done is better than perfect, only because in innovation, there is no perfect. And it's about that continual, going forward in that particular way. And by executing, you're then able to have the impact that you want to have in what you're achieving. And what I want to do now, after for the bias to action, is to link it back to, I guess, the point of focus, and just to bring it back to some examples from our experience. And I mean, one thing that if you read Elon Musk's early work and some of that, just how he realized that there were very big, well-funded competitors against many of the businesses he built. But what he realized was if he put in more time and singularly focused on a particular business, which he isn't doing now because he's got many businesses under his belt, but I think focusing on solving that particular problem, he's been able to achieve phenomenal things. And I remember when we the year actually we launched Go1, 2015, we were just about to go on a roadshow to raise capital from our initial investors. And Lynda, which is now LinkedIn Learning, got bought by Microsoft, I think for $1.2 billion at the time. And it's both a good and a bad thing. So the good thing is it showed to our investors, hey, there's actually possibly a big opportunity in Mighty made in this space. On the other side, you're realizing that you've got a very big, and at least then people see it as a competitor, even though Lynda today or LinkedIn Learning is a partner of ours, you've got a big player in the market who has a lot of money and can easily come for your lunch or take your idea. And I think, often you'll find, and it's unfortunate when people try to build businesses in tech, the first question, I guess inexperienced investors will ask is, what happens if Google builds this? Or what happens if Microsoft builds this? And the reality is people discount just the benefit one has of a singular focus and execution to actually drive value. And so for us, it was about saying, look, how do we keep the main thing, and it being born in our problems that we experience? Because the reality is this: if you understand a problem and you consider solutions to solve it, and you realize there actually isn't something that's solving that particular problem in a meaningful way, then there's a gap in the market. And even if there are bigger players in a similar space, if you're able to clinically focus on that particular gap, you're able to achieve significant results. And so from that perspective, it's something which has definitely helped us in our journey in definitely thinking through how best do we out-execute our competitors. And look, by no means, we were very fortunate to have good investors on our journey, phenomenal teams, and you've grown. But given the opportunity and the global opportunity when it comes to tech, but I think the tech intersection between learning and development where we play, we are still very much small fry. And so it's only the beginning of our journey. And so it's thinking through how do we continually double down and think through that particular way. And I mean, the best example of focus, which I love, and I'll make reference to Dallas. And I'd be remiss of me not to pull up a photo of Dallas. But essentially, and I don't mean dollars. So it's interesting, during, unfortunately, it was the River Steenkamp trial with Oscar Pistorius, and everyone got familiar with the law around Dolus Eventualis, but I'm meaning dollars as in DOLOS. And I will quickly just share my screen to bring up a photo of what a dollars is, because I think for me, it's an important, for our business, we have offices around the world, and we often travel a fair bit. And so I'll just leave it on this mode. I won't go to presentation mode, but this is what a dollars is. And it's something which you'll see no doubt across many coastlines in South Africa. And we have 2 offices in the US. And whether you're on the West Coast, Florida side, or even more so on the West Coast in the US, you'll literally see dollars all over the coastline. And now the dollars is a fascinating South African invention, which for me is both inspiring, but also leaves one with lessons to consider. So the dollars, as a fun fact, was invented by a South African, Mr. Merrifield, and he was actually a employee of then the predecessor to Transnet in the 1960s. And again, it can exist to, and my engineers will call me out, but essentially to stop the erosion that exists at the coastline by virtue of the waves and then meeting the shoreline. And so really just to reinforce the actual foundation of the ground. And so this has gone on, and even today has ultimately is still being used in many coastlines across the world. Yet, unfortunately, it wasn't patented and there wasn't any IP. And so the commercialization thereof, unfortunately, didn't reap the full benefit as it could have, both for him, but also I think even for South Africa, and I think even the university ecosystem and even his employer at the time. And it's one of those things where when you think about innovation, it's a weird one where people often believe that their idea is their IP. And I agree that ideas and the IP itself has a value when coupled with execution. So for example, if he created this particular dollars, but had never actually put it to work through the then equivalent of Transnet, it wouldn't be what it is today. But I think what's important is not being afraid to think through, when you have an idea, the commercialization elements of it. Because ultimately, when someone buys a business, they'll buy a business for your revenue, they'll buy it for your IP. But the question is that IP yours? How is it secured? And what does it actually mean? And I think depending on the kind of business you find yourself in, IP to different extents has greater bearing. And so I think in this particular instance here, when you think about the dollars, it came down ultimately to, are you able to, one, patent your ideas if you're really doing something really innovative, but also in the same vein, over and above a patent, how do you then build up a moat over and above just the IP? And so you can think of a example like, I don't know, I'll take Uber as an example. It's very easy, and you'll be surprised how easy it is for someone to rebuild the Uber application today. For example, to have an interface where a driver can see their GPS and pick up a rider, where a rider can go see where the driver is and get a notification about where they're coming and say they want to go. Where the value really comes, and this is why tech companies these days seem to get very large valuations, is because of that feedback loop in the ecosystem, where if you had the Uber app today, you wouldn't have the same sort of ecosystem where you have riders who are attracting drivers and vice versa, and then being able to loop that back into their payment gateways and everything around that. And so what you see these days when it comes to innovation technology and commercialization is almost thinking through, how do you create moats even over and above the IP itself? And I think that's where the most valuable business models are able to think through that. It's almost like a positive flywheel that one sees in their operations, and something which we're very fortunate on our side as a business to have, just because of the ecosystem, where the more learners or users we have on the platform, the better our ability is to attract the best content providers. And the best content providers we have, the more users we're able to attract. And also the same thing goes for our content providers as we've gone along and built out our learning solution. And so ultimately, I guess just to bring together the points around, when I think about, one, creating innovation or market creating innovation, but also market changing innovation. I think one, in our journey, it's been a function of deeply understanding our problem and continually innovating on the journey as we better understand what the needs of our customers. I think two, it's been having a bias towards action and getting things out there and and not necessarily getting lost in the thought experiment of what we could be building and the idea thereof. And I think the third one, which is one around focus, where I still believe that nothing can conquer a focused mind, and just being able to focus on the problem you're trying to solve and do so diligently in a structured way will get you a very long way. And I think it would be remiss of me not to speak as a final part before we go to Q&A, just around, I guess, how does one operationalize that from a business perspective? And so right now as a business, we have teams across 7 countries, just under 300 employees. And it's easy, it's just a group of founders around the table, gunning away, not sleeping at night, getting things done. But the question is, how do you then create that culture? How do you create that, how do you bring about innovation within your organization? And I'm a firm believer that people make businesses, and in the same vein can break a business, but ultimately a business is nothing without its people. And so if you're enabling your people to innovate, and to live out some of the elements that I've spoken to you about now, how do they deeply understand the problem? So giving them face time in front of their clients, not limiting them just to, let's say, reports on support tickets. How do you enable them to have a bias towards action and those sorts of things? And so for me, I almost see 3 things that I think as, people who are currently managing businesses, as managers, but even as you're thinking about your business and your teams you want to bring together to take to the next phase, is 3 elements. And I think one would be, allowing failure, which, is something which in African culture, we don't fully embrace as much as some of our Western colleagues. I mean, if in the US, there's literally a conference, which I'm sure is happening virtually now, called FailCon, where people will actually go out and literally be like, look, I am 2 failures away from my unicorn. And literally knowing that failure is a part of that learning journey. Whereas often we find in culture, and I think it's something where if someone says I want to try a business and they fail, they'll be like, this one, you could have gotten a job at corporate, always a failure. And that almost stigma prevents one from actually trying to take the risk and actually invest themselves fully into what they're trying to achieve. And I think creating that culture where failure is accepted and tolerated, of course, with the measures of learning from it, I think goes a very long way. I think the second piece is agency. And I think agency, in the sense of comes to people, is giving people the leeway and the ability to fail. Because if you micromanage people, you don't necessarily allow their ability to come to the fore. You'll not be able to bring out that innovation. And so my theory has always been that, if you hire the right people, it's up to you as a manager or boss to create an enabling environment for them to succeed. And so I'm very big on our managers really staying close and having communication channels very open with their reportees. But in the same vein, they're also being them having the ability to say, fine, if we agree on the main objective we're trying to achieve, alignments on the goals and the visions, and these are the tools you can use to get there, almost giving someone the leeway to apply their best selves to actually get that opportunity and to solve the problem that is. And so it's not necessarily micromanaging or over-defining certain elements of what their task involves. And I think the final piece, which I think is an important one, which one can take for granted, is the adequate resources. I think ultimately, if you don't necessarily have the resources that will enable your team to succeed, you can't necessarily say, well, they're allowed to fail, they've got the agency, not giving them the resources. And so for us, resourcing is a big part of that. So how do they have the tools to enable them to succeed? And so if ultimately what I'm saying is give your people, allow them to fail, give them the agency to do what they want, and give them all the money they want, how do you stop them from running riot? I think the key thing comes down to creating that culture in the organization where innovation is supported, such that when you have those three things in place, you aren't necessarily going to run riot, and you're going to actually work towards the objectives of the actual organization itself. And so I will pause there, and it'd be great to transition to, I'm sure what Vuyo would say is the Q&A, and I'm seeing some questions come up in the chat as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Marvin. I think quite a couple of themes coming across this as well. You scale, iteration, the clinical focus that one needs in order to scale, right? And I think also what the team at UNISA will be very happy that you brought up, but this commercialization of your intellect as well as you're creating these creating innovations. And I think before I pass it over to the community for Q&A, I'll sneak in my two questions that I have. And I think one, particularly as an investor, right, and mentioning the key topic around commercialization of your intellect is looking at protection of your idea and how you can actually protect your idea when you're pitching to investors. I'm wary of the conversation around when you do go pitch to investors, a couple of entrepreneurs are wanting them to sign NDAs and protecting themselves and protecting their ideas. So I really just wanted to harness your thoughts around that particular engagement. And secondly, as a corporate innovator, because you didn't start off as an entrepreneur, you do have some experience in corporate and becoming a corporate innovator, advising enterprises, advising governments in the public sector. And as you speak to entrepreneurship and the capabilities that one needs in order to create this environment that will enable your employees, your staff to also become these innovators, the capabilities that enabled you to transition or to transfer the knowledge, the skills to co-found GoOne with your founder.
Yeah, no, and I think two important points asked there, and I think I'll start with the first one, particularly as it relates to protection of IP. And it's something where any decent investor, unless it's like to your point around really like deep IP-rich tech, when you're asked to sign an NDA, they'll often be put off. And this is more from a Silicon Valley and from my experience in that particular way. And it's doing like, stuff in the very like biomedical and so forth, in that particular way. And I think it's almost like, I find, and this is again my experience, where almost there's benefit to sharing your idea with more people than otherwise, because the more you share your idea, the more refinement you have on it. And I think what you find even in the local ecosystem, if you go to invest and you say, like, look, sign an NDA, or else I won't pitch it to you, you probably won't get the chance to actually get their capital. And so I think I'm of the opinion, rather share your ideas and let people contribute to your thinking, how you go through it. Because ultimately, I believe the strongest value is often found in one's execution ability in that particular way. But again, that's based on my experience, because the reality is, if I had a cure for COVID a few months ago, I would not have shared the IP. I would have gone straight to production. And so from that perspective, it does vary, but it's more so based on my experience. I think just the final point around, I think coming from a corporate space, I think what corporate did well, and I think that's for many people, and South Africa corporate more broadly, is it's a good learning and training ground. I think it gives you the language to be able to speak to your customers, to speak to your investors, to understand the basic skill sets, but also importantly, to understand the problem you want to solve. I mean, if you think about, Adrian Gort Discovery coming out of Liberty, being an actuary there, and just realizing that, look, there was a gap in the products being offered at the point in time. And he even tried to pitch it, from my understanding, to Liberty back then, and they weren't receptive to the idea, and hence he found other partners. But I think it's almost, I see corporate and, entrepreneurship at corporate because you don't leave your jobs if you're in corporate, but it's almost, you're getting paid to actually almost understand your problem. And I think that's phenomenal.
Absolutely. I'm going to cross it over to Akampa and then Danny, who do have questions. Our first question coming through from Akampa saying, what do you think of the culture of where we are told that we are too young to start? That's an interesting one. And then once Melvin answers that question, I'm going to ask Danny to unmute his mic and then go on and engage with Melvin.
Oh, awesome. Just the question around being too young. It's something which, the funny thing is, the proof is in the pudding. And the greatest innovators you're finding these days are the young people. And I don't know what the reason is. I don't think it's in the water, anything of that nature. But I think that something which when we were building out GoOne, just to be anecdotal. So I was building up a team in the US. And to be fair, many of the clients were, okay, there's a young African guy. What does he know about e-learning? Coming from the US himself. And so I did hire some white male colleagues who I could represent in front of clients when they had certain conversations. Ultimately, they reported to me, but it was a non-issue around that, because keeping the main thing allows you to say, look, regardless of my starting point, how can I use my youth as an advantage? And so for me, it was often that people would underestimate me, and therefore they would be more surprised by our offering or what we brought together. And so that was actually an advantage that we used to our fore. So the culture does exist, but it's overcome through action and example. And so I definitely think that these days, more so than before, young people can thrive. That being said, I mean, something I always reflect on is like when I think the Colonel was in his 60s when he started KFC. And something I always reflect on very deep in my mind is that when Ernest Oppenheimer began Anglo, he was 34. And so it's not a sort of rush to be like, if I'm not 20 or 30, I can't start a business of great value, which is also the other side of the coin there.
Absolutely. And recently, Forbes as well started the 50 over 50 list as well. So it's not only the 30 and the 30s or the under 20s or the teens that are achieving, but I think definitely should we have these networks, these enabling environments to enable us to do so, then anything is possible. And the resources from UNISA as well that exist, that we do encourage you to grab a hold of. Danny, I'm going to come over to you and ask you to unmute your mic and go on ahead and ask your question to Melvin.
Thank you for your, hi Melvin, good to chat again. So in the beginning of your discussion, you touched a bit on, or in fact, I think it was before you actually even started, there was a bit of a discussion around how new technology companies start up as startups. And then towards the end of your discussion, you touched on resources. And I know that you interact with one of the ministries around technology. Now, one of the big issues that we have in South Africa, whether you're in the tech space or not, is funding. Now, the minister and different parts of government talk about the importance of the fourth industrial revolution, although it's not an industrial revolution, it's a technology revolution. So I think therein lies already a bit of a disconnect in terms of what is going on. And they talk about the digital divide and all of that. The tools, or make available the tools for the young, the middle-aged, or the over 50 people in South Africa to bring their great ideas, especially the technology innovations, to the fore, to be able to be actualized. Even if you're looking at something that is not technology-based, we talk about a window at the DTI called the Black Industrialist Funding Scheme, or the other one on the technology side at the TIA. The unfortunate experience by many people that I talk to is that none of these are working. And for us to be able to get to a point where in South Africa we create real jobs in the technology space, we need to get guys in government to understand this gap. There is no funding available for people with great ideas. Now, Melvin, you are sitting on some committee with some minister in technology. Please use that to get them to understand that the Black Industrialist Scheme doesn't work for ordinary industrialization. It doesn't exist for technology. The TIA doesn't work for technology. We need to start there before we can build up a massive cadre of an equivalent of a Silicon Valley in South Africa to make a difference in this country and across this continent by bridging the digital. There's so much that can be done to bridge the digital divide, but it's not going to happen if many of these ideas end up in the graveyard. Thanks.
No. And if we're happy to take that one directly, and I think, Danny, thanks for the comments. I mean, you know, we serve on these bodies to be able to bring the change you want to see. And I think, look, by no means is the system that we have in place perfect, but I think definitely it is going leaps and bounds. Just a point of reflection, I think, on something around the point around financing and resourcing. There's 2 points I want to make. One was a comment from a mentor where he said that, you know, you entrepreneurs these days are spoiled because when we were starting our businesses, there wasn't funding available. The only funding was to our customers. We actually had to create something people actually wanted to pay for in order for us to build our businesses. And obviously, he's done fairly well for himself when he had a different context coming into that. But that's the one point around your customers are ultimately your best source of funding. Whether that's through PEEP, and I think in our journey early on, our first customers, we literally had a PowerPoint presentation and we showed them what the thing could look like and took prepayments to make it happen. But I think in the same vein, when one thinks through, you know, government plays many roles as a regulator, as a funder, and I think there are different roles it plays. But I think when it comes to funding, I think government can play definitely a more catalytic role in supporting innovation. But the good thing about, and I come back to economics and the invisible hand and free market, is that if innovation, like the funding is not only limited to government. I mean, if you're creating something that is of value to to people more broadly, private sector investors, individuals will support your endeavor. And I think the question is then, how do you go and find those people? I was on a conversation the other night with investors, and people were looking to deploy money because during COVID, their, let's say, list of portfolios haven't done poorly, haven't done well, and so forth. And so it's also important to consider, one, different ways of financing, debt, equity, and everything else, but also know that there's more than just government from a funding perspective. But I think directly to your point, though, I think there's a lot more that we can do as a country, more importantly, to support innovation, even at the earlier stages.
I'm going to take 2 more questions. One from Keith, a double questions from Keith as he snuck those in, and then another from Ulwazi, who has his hands raised up. The 2 questions coming in from Keith, and I think you can see those in the comments section, but one is touching on the failure topic and asking whether you specifically subscribe to the failing fast, and I'll add on failing forward as well, that concept. And then the second piece is really on scaling and your subscription to scaling either on the individual element with the same effort as ease, and I'm guessing it's on 2 different products that you would be approaching. So I don't know if that's clear. And then once we tackle Keith's questions, I am quite cognizant of time. We will go over just slightly, but I do want to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to get their questions in. So Melvin, I'll hand that over to you.
No, awesome. And thank you for the question, Keith. I think, so the one thing I believe is that if you aren't failing, you probably aren't taking the right risk. And, you know, there was once a saying that, you know, if you aren't living life on the edge, you're taking up too much space. And so from that perspective, when it comes down to failing fast, I think you need to fail fast, because by you focusing on something that is not going to succeed, you're taking away resources, time, and effort from the pivot or the thing you should be focusing on. And so that's where you almost have to be clinical and unapologetic about, if you aren't able to know what success or failure looks like in your business, in your quarter, in your month, in your plans, then you aren't taking enough risk and you aren't pushing yourself enough as an organization. And so I firmly believe in the failing fast. But I think when it comes to failure, I'm also not a big fan of total failure, because the reality is, when we began the business and we're just young guys, push came to shove, if the business failed, we could have gone back to our parents' houses and say, Mom, we tried, help us out. But now when you have so many people relying on you to continue to grow as a business, we also are a bit more structured in the risks that we do take. And I think this probably speaks to your second point around, when you think about scaling individual elements or investing in growth individual elements, ultimately, I always see most decisions as a manager as a allocation of resources. And so the question in allocating resources, the heuristic that I would apply is where I'm applying that effort going to get me the greatest return? And so if you think about from a sales perspective, do I put up a billboard? Do I cold call, or do I spend money on Facebook ads? Each of those will cost money, and each of them will have a different return. And so when it comes on different elements of our product, we want to invest on those elements that will have the greatest benefit. And so we do invest in different products differently. So for example, right now, big focus of us is how do we better harness all the data we have and better be able to use that to provide a better user experience through machine learning for our end customers. And so that would probably be the thoughts on that there.
Brilliant. I'm going to cross it over to Ulwazi with your question. I'm going to ask that you keep it brief and sweet.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Vuyo, and good afternoon. Good afternoon to you, Melvin. I think my question is actually raised by, it's not a question, but perhaps a statement to further encourage you, Melvin, in the committees that you're sitting in government. Danny actually touched on a very critical aspect, and I think the way we're looking at it, I think as a country is not perhaps the best way to look at it in terms of funding. I think what we should be doing is looking at it from a perspective of creating opportunity for revenue streams instead of a funding approach, where innovators are drawn into the government pocket through a process of procurement. And if we do that, I think that will create a lot of opportunities. But the challenge is the policies that we have at the moment, especially if you're looking at the innovation policy and the white paper and the current draft 10-year plan, they do speak to the role of procurement in terms of innovation. But when you're looking at the actual procurement policies, they do not touch on innovation, and innovation in itself is very complex and requires one to actually look at it in a different viewpoint, and not necessarily the actual procurement that you do for goods and services and works, for example. So it becomes critical that we take a different stance and look at government as a client and not necessarily as a funder, but government needs to also take a different view of its policies, because it's the policies that will enable. So I think that's the campaign that I'm driving at the moment, Melvin, and perhaps maybe at some point we'll get the opportunity to engage on that. That's just what I'd share.
No, just a brief comment on that. I think, Ulwazi, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of that dual relationship. And I think it even comes down to the scope of work of an RFP, and to see how one not only incentivize innovation, but also to make sure that it clearly articulates the problem. So when someone builds a solution for that problem, it actually addresses what actually drives value. And I think it goes work on both ways. And so I fully agree in terms of, because look, the biggest employer, the biggest buyer in the country is public sector and government. And so if you solve a problem for them, you can do fairly well for yourself. And so that's something which is definitely well taken. I noted a comment, Vuyo, on the group around best business books for 2020 or 2021, since we're here now. And I'd probably say, I'd say probably two that come to mind, just because they're ones which are classics. And I mean, one, I'm a big fan of biographies and learning from other people's journeys. And so we always find reading a biography. And so one which I quite enjoy, particularly when it comes down to tech and innovation, is The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which has been Harvard's, and so Ben Harvard's very successful tech entrepreneur and now successful very venture capitalist. And what I like is he's very raw in the realities of sharing what it took him or what it takes to innovate and to lead an innovative business. And I think that's definitely goes a long way in just, the grit of it. And the second one is Creativity Inc. And Creativity Inc. is a book written by Ed Catmull. And so Ed Catmull was a director at Pixar. And so just thinking through how they go through their creativity process, I think there are lots of learnings there, both for managers and leaders, but also when thinking through innovation and also how do you create a culture of innovation. And so that's definitely one of those ones which, I mean, probably got my team to read it 4 years back and we've never looked back. And so definitely still remains a classic.
Absolutely. Well, Melvin, there's another comment that I know you see, but I'm not sure you'll read. And that's one is coming from Melvin Hunsoon, and he says, thank you for sharing your insights, Melvin. You are an excellent example and inspiration for all South Africans, demonstrating that execution is where the magic happens. Not sure if you mentioned that GoOne is now valued at $1 billion US, and he leaves a wink there. And accompanying that, also thank you from Ulwazi for the brilliant session, and saying he has to rush to another meeting. And before Ulwazi rushes to that meeting, Melvin, as we wrap up, how can people get a hold of you? As you know, I think the conversations have already started. There's a couple of advisory points in terms of what you can take to task to the ministry. How can people get a hold of you, and how can they connect?
Yeah, so I mean, in this time of lockdown, I wish I could be out in the sun on some grassy knoll and say we can meet up somewhere. But I think given the current times, probably virtually. And so best via LinkedIn or even via Instagram. So Melvin Lubega, you can definitely find me then. We can definitely pick up some of the conversations from here as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again, Melvin, for joining us. And we definitely appreciate your robust conversation and the advisory that you provided. And hopefully people will be connecting with you. And I've already seen quite a couple of LinkedIn connections on my end. I'm sure that your end, quite a couple are coming through as well. Well, join us again next month for quite another incredible Innovation in Action lecture series. And we'll be joined by Thembiso Makajana, who is an entrepreneur who works particularly in the non-profit company space in rural development, linking that and pairing that with entrepreneurship as well as education. To reserve your seat and make sure that you do not miss out, RSVP innovation at unisa.ac.za. That's innovation at unisa.az.za. A huge thank you to Ayanda Noma, the Director of Innovation, Technology Transfer and Commercialization at the University of South Africa, as well as our guest lecturer today, Melvin Lubega, an entrepreneur, an investor, and a digital evangelist. My name is Violeta Dubese. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in our next Innovation in Action lecture. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. I suppose the recording